They make movies here. I live here. Sometimes I think that gives me the right to criticize the way movies depict my city. I know it's not easy. The city's big. The image is small. Movies are vertical, at least when they're projected on a screen. The city is horizontal, except for what we call downtown. Maybe that's why the movies love downtown more than we do.
Ah. Wait. No. What the fuck?
We now have an iTunes feed and a Libsyn feed. You no longer can just find us on YouTube. If you would be so kind as to review us on iTunes, we'd be really grateful because we're producing this for free, and that's how people will find out of us. So if you enjoy it, tell someone. Today, we are talking about the ephemeral development of new media, but not in the normal way that people do. We're not going to talk about how liberatory all this is, or any of the buzzwords you heard about new media for the past decade. In fact, in some ways, new media is funny because it's now 10 years old and it's not entirely new anymore. But we're going to start with something that's definitively not new media. Wouldn't you say, Stephen?
Yeah. We're gonna start talking about the film, which, although just recently gotten attention, is at least 10 years old. LA Plays Itself. And no, I wouldn't call it new media. It's a film essay based upon excerpts from any number of films depicting or taking place in LA on some level. But what's interesting about it is that it prefigures in its own way a lot of what new media, quote unquote, would become. Unintentionally so, but it's funny that a film which only comes to light, let's say this year, comes to light in a perfect time in order to look on it that way, if you know what I mean. It's like we can now see it for what it sort of was, whether or not it had an influence on everything or not.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in context, the LA Place Itself has been around since 2003, and a variety of, what I believe is a variety of legal issues. It wasn't really given a wide release except for private screenings until this year. And you used to be, if you wanted to see this, you either had to get a pirated recording of one of the private screenings, or you had to be in a place that would do the screening.
Right, and the funny thing was, I think at a certain points in time it did exist on YouTube. Is, for lack of a better term, illegally. Whether it was or was not illegal is sort of inconsequential. But yeah, it was sort of like a bootleggish kind of culty thing, somewhat. Only recently can you now find it on Netflix, and you're right, largely because the author, I think he's a professor at UCLA, is that right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. He cleared through the legal battle largely on what would become a critical component of a lot of what you'll see on YouTube, fair use. So he cleared that through, and it's now on Netflix, and I wouldn't say it's become super huge, but I think it's starting to get a buzz beyond the sort of cult that it's developed primarily in LA for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I've known about this film for years, but I have friends in Northern California, so of course it's interesting to me what it is and isn't. It's also interesting to me how, and not just about the YouTube sense, how it feels more in line with the Zeitgeist right now than it did in 2003.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
let's sort of like pause and say what it is. In some, on a certain level, it's, using the films depicting LA to have some sort of sociological discussion of not just LA but the depiction of LA and what this all sort of means in unison, or at least that's the plan. And you're right, there are elements of it now which feels extraordinarily relevant to a lot of conversations that are being had, at least in certain circles. The one most obvious element is the relationship of the police with the everyday citizen. Another relationship is basically a general, wouldn't you agree with me, sort of leftist, somewhat radical position, or at least it conceives of itself that way.
Yeah, although it's very inchoate, like it goes back and forth in my mind between sort of like a Marxist framework, but then also has strong liberalish critiques, and then has like critiques against Philistinism that aren't actually in step with other things unless you look at it deeper. I mean, we have to talk about the different elements of the argument. Also, there are some like modeling arguments, like arguments about the sort of conceptual framework one should use for understanding film versus understanding geography that are superficially profound, but when you think about them for 30 seconds, fall apart.
Well,
Which I think
yeah. There's
common right now.
Oh yeah, that's in a weird way. I think that's why it feels in many ways more relevant now, because it's a manifestation of a sort of incoherence that I think a lot of the left, or a liberal left, faces. One of my favorite lines, and it comes up right at the beginning of the movie, is when the essayist says, you know, film is a vertical medium. That's why people in LA always film downtown. Which, if you really think about it for 2 seconds, is the most stupid thing you've ever heard. Especially because, I don't know, the image of a frame typically is horizontal. And that's why landscapes are typically filmed, not so much vertical buildings. I mean, if LA is filmed in the downtown setting, it's largely because it's unfortunately the only thing besides the Hollywood sign that's recognizable about the place. But yeah, that's a kind of like superficial attempt at saying, oh wow, that's kind of profound. But when you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense. Or at least it's a manifestation of someone who arguably doesn't give that much of a shit about film, which I think sort of permeates throughout the rest of the doc.
Right. And yet it's the same sort of the obsessive compulsiveness about film that actually, like, in a way undermines this argument. Because this guy had to watch at least, I don't know, 400 films.
It certainly feels like there's at least three significant figures of a number of films watched through this movie for sure.
I actually, because I would say this, there was films he was referencing, and they're neither cult films nor mainstream films. Like they're like really quickly produced like films from the 70s and exploitation films and stuff that you would have to be a film completist to have ever even heard of.
Oh yeah, he talks about these famous. He talked about two very esoteric and yet in his mind epically important porno films, which are like, I've never heard of either of these films.
Right. And and then he talks about a genre of cop films from like 1975 to like 1984 that like I think everyone has just forgotten unless they were alive in 1975 and 1984. I mean, and I was, but I don't remember that.
No, that is I would say a positive externality of this film. I know exactly that genre of cop films, but also a few of those exploitation films in the 70s, or some weird sci-fi films. If there's a good thing, and also some of the later films that the doc depicts, is like the positive externality is the fact that I now want to watch these films.
There's a whole bunch of stuff I've only partly seen or have ever seen, like even stuff like The Messiah of Evil. Surrealist horror film.
Exactly. The one where a woman is in a grocery store being chased by whatever, fill in the blank. I don't even know what they are.
They're zombie vampires, because I don't believe they can get to the rights to either thing. oddly enough. Because the ghoulish zombies were still kind of protected under copyright from Dawn of the Dead. Although, interestingly, if you know anything about that movie, that copyright doesn't stand because they forgot to put a symbol on the thing. So that's why flesh-eating zombie ghouls are actually public domain as a clerical error. Mm-hmm. But apparently at the time they didn't realize that, so they came up with these vampire zombie things that's related to a cannibal cult. It's actually very, very weird. But
doesn't this all sort of come from like I Am Legend basically had conceived of its antagonists, for lack of a better term, as vampirish kind of creatures, and then as people made their iterations on it, they couldn't use vampire per se, probably because it was owned, or at least at a high level, by Universal, and so they started developing the concept of the zombie by mixing, obviously, a little bit of Caribbean elements to it, but mostly just trying to have a vampire without calling it that, and so it's all like you said. It's there because of legal reasons.
Like Dawn of the Dead was actually supposed to be ghouls. They were like Arabic ghouls, and for some reason I don't even remember. They just decided to call them zombies. And between the vampire creatures and the ghouls becoming zombies, that's where the zombie came from. But that's not really tangentially relevant to the film. Although those are the kinds of tangents you get. The film, it sounds like we're really negative on it. I actually enjoyed it, although it's incredibly long. But it's so inconsistent. Like even like when you pair it, when you pair its ideology against itself, because he spends this whole there's almost a 20-minute sequence discussing like all the anti-modernist architecture stuff you see in a lot of like big tent movies like Lethal Weapon and.
It's. I think the way to think about it, maybe you agree, maybe you don't. I don't think of this film as having a coherent, singular argument going through. There are some key themes, but it's not so much a singular vision. It feels like a series of conversations you would have with this professor over an evening, and there's a central theme of L.A. There's probably a central theme of the notion of sociology and the way art reflects on it, but outside of that, I mean, it's like I'm going to talk about this, and then maybe I'll go over here and talk about that, et cetera, et cetera. So
he makes claims that he does make a lot of claims about cynicism and how cynicism is powerful that I both want to agree with and yet also think it's not entirely true what he's arguing about cynicism. And in fact, some of his own historical facts, in a way he's pointing out that people weren't cynical enough about the actual history of LA, and that a lot of it was just out in the open.
Right. So, like one example which we could go into because it sort of is reflective of a film we have already discussed is the long detail he goes into Chinatown. So I think anybody who's seen Chinatown knows that it is developing a kind of mythical foundational story for LA. The notion of the water movement or theft from one area to another, the development of LA around that sort of original sin, if you want to speak about it metaphorically. His point on that was that, well, actually, this stuff happened all out in the open. There wasn't like a conspiracy theory construction going on which allowed bad things to happen under the radar. His point was that it was all out in the open, and the movies like Chinatown and LA Confidential create a fictional conspiracy theory construct to hide people from the fact that all this was out in the open and we were all complicit. I don't think either film necessarily really does that. I think if there's a conspiratorial element, it's a conspiracy of attempting to forget the past. Because, like, if you really look at Chinatown, it doesn't hide anything. It isn't really. It's conspiratorial on some sense, but with the shit that's going on about the bond, the water bond, and all of that other crap, that's out in the open as well.
Say, it's all stuff that he figured out basically from reading the news and just putting stuff together. The actual conspiracy is personal,
right?
I mean, and. Like, LA Confidential, I can see his argument a little better there, but But again, I almost think that this is something where the 2003 date's important. That's a critique of neo-noir in the 90s that he kind of then retrofits to neo-noir in the 60s and 70s. And also actually even places on noir itself, because he talks about noir movies in almost the same way, like actually, 1950s noir movies. And that just feels like he's reading 90s cynicism, which, take it or leave it. I think that's a real critique. I think LA Confidential is a good movie, but I think he might be right about its cynicism. But I actually don't think that, I mean, like, what he doesn't point out in the last scene, the reason why he loses wasn't that they kept the conspiracy about water under wraps or blew it open. It's that he got a woman killed.
Right. Exactly. Well, this is actually critical to understanding this documentary, and it's a provocative statement by me, but I think it's true, which is we are dealing with an approach to the critique of film which really doesn't care about aesthetics of film per se. It cares about sociology, and it manifests itself in a variety of ways. One is this way we're talking about right now, where the film noir as metaphor or as an artifice talking about the human condition, for lack of a better term, is lost on him. What isn't lost on him is the quote unquote, what does it mean about history? What does it mean about human, the sociology of human relations, this, that, and the other. He doesn't really pick up on it, and it's reflective not only in the way he reads film noirs, and particularly the neo-noirs, but it also is reflective on what films he holds up as, great. And typically they're neorealism, which, again, I would even argue he doesn't entirely grasp what neorealism is doing. Neorealism has a lot more human emotional elements than he's giving it credit for. He just likes the fact that this is depicting the LA that isn't Hollywood. This is depicting something that is an artifice. It's like, well, unlike him, I understand the importance and relevance of artifice. But that's just something that you have to sort of deal with.
And also, neorealism is artifice. That's the fact. Yeah, I guess my good old lefty credentials are going to come out. But the fact that people still argue this Lukácsian bullshit today, when it was shot down by communists and by other communists in the 30s, is kind of crazy. I hate to say it, but it's a Stalinist approach to cinema that liberals for some reason like. That I don't I really don't get. Look, I think those neorealist movies that you talked about are great. I think they are interesting, and particularly in the way they show the Hispanic community and the Black community.
Oh, absolutely.
The way they react to that. But, I mean, you can get that from Spike Lee, too.
Funny, this may be a tangent, but I think we should go into that sort of like Stalinist approach to literature. This is going to link to our last podcast, but one of my favorite little details that came up when I was reading Kolakowski is he goes into Lukács's reading of Solzhenitsyn, and Lukács was a fan of Solzhenitsyn, but he says Solzhenitsyn's greatness is that he is an example of social realism. His fault is that he needs to be bring about his pro-communist views even more loudly, which basically Kolakowski laughs off as the one of the best examples of socialist realism or socialist literary theory becoming an absolute joke of itself.
Right. Well, but the thing is, like what Marx wrote about social realism and stuff, which is interesting, actually. Like, he actually wrote mostly about really reactionary authors. So, like Steinhall and stuff. And he says that, that these people are just really honest about what they see in the world. And he was actually critiquing a lot of, stuff that you saw in the labor movement, in the literature around the labor movements from liberals in the 1920s in both Germany and the United States, where it was not 1920s, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, look at the noble savage, see how awesome he is. Look at the noble factory worker, see how awesome they are.
Right.
I mean, because it's just not realistic. But what's interesting, about that is even from a left-wing approach, that is an approach that kind of dominates a lot of the time. But it's one that there's a perfectly good left-wing tradition that rejects it already.
Yeah, but wouldn't you also say that a lot of the argumentation you're going to get from LA Plays itself feels almost like a thesis or a paper or a course class you would get from sort of like your middle tier English department now, or even like from the 90s, which is like, remember like when Harold Bloom was ranting about like the people have abandoned aesthetics in favor of theory. This feels like almost an artifact of that as well.
Yes. What is interesting to me is like I actually think this trend is no longer actually that dominant in academia. Maybe I'm wrong, but because I haven't been truly in academia for a while, but most of the books I'm reading aren't heading that way anymore. But it now seems to be dominant in pop culture.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's like whatever happens in the academy, like take 10 years and their students, and it'll get dumber, and then part of pop culture. Like I remember, like basically what I used to say the '90s is like, oh my God, pop culture found existentialism.
Albeit that one was 40 years later.
Yeah, but I mean, like it did feel that way. I mean, and you can really sort of see how this moves. It's very interesting. Like you could compare this to say a Zizek film like Perverse Guide to Cinema or Perverse Guide to Ideology, which are actually very, very similar.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And equally inconsistent. Although I don't think Zizek would have a lot of patience for the anti-aesthetic of this.
I think Zizek would probably be perfectly fine if if it was revealed that this film, the author didn't really pay too many attention to the movies beyond their point in articulating his theory. But I agree with you that Zizek is much more interested in the aesthetics than this guy is, without a doubt. But you're right. They're adopting a similar. Maybe strategy is the right word in terms of how you use the material at hand to articulate your point. And maybe that's why maybe we would start getting into this film as a pre-configuration or an early echo of what we would start seeing, not just on like the web, but just almost in general with like a reflection on art and using it as a source for an essay. It feels like there has become, in the last 10 years, we have a kind of genre or subgenre of sort of secondary essays or secondary art, which manifests this. I mean, we kind of do it in our own way here, but you see it in the proliferation, even in the most lowbrow sense, on YouTube or other channels of like people who says like, yeah, like the guy with the glasses and his like my top 10 movies that scarred my childhood and all this kind of thing. They try to use clips to articulate their aesthetic criteria, and some do it much better than others. I mean, even in our magazine, I interviewed one guy who does it better. It's almost exclusively in sci-fi, but it's the same basic idea. This feels very contemporary in that regard, but that's obviously it has its interesting things and it has its drawbacks. I'd like to hear your take on it.
I find it interesting. This is going to sound crazy. I find it interesting in this genre of commentary, which has been, just expanding in a way that I don't think people realize how much more commentary there is. Because at the same time this is happening, like the idea of like a television critic or even a humanities professor is becoming less and less tenable, interestingly enough. So in a way, as this thing spreads, the professions that were sort of built off of it are dying. But that's not really what interests me. What interests me even more about it is that if you talk about people who can talk about the aesthetics of things right now, you know what they talk about? Grindhouse movies and kitsch.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, there's this. Yeah, you're right. There's a manifestation, and I'll try to link it to LA Plays itself. But you're right. Though if anybody's talking about aesthetics, it's from a defensive position. It's usually someone say, "Hey, these kitschy science fiction series from the '60s were important, and they had substance, and here's why." Grindhouse movies, they may have had like exploitation and like fucking this person or that person, and but god damn it, it had some value. And like I'm like, yeah, yes and no, depends on what you're talking about. I'm not gonna dismiss something from a pure genre level. I don't do that. But you're right, it is in that regard. But what's also interesting to me is that combined with that that defensiveness, there's also a decreasing amount of rigor and skill. So like we had mentioned in, or at least I did in LA Plays Itself, you got the sense that, this fundamentally was a film about film, but it was a film about film by someone who doesn't per se care about the aesthetics of film. And so
But
what
there's a
there's
whole
like,
lot about history, like
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
whole lot about history, and then but it also feels divorced from the history of film. And one thing I didn't mention, it's weirdly snobby despite its Marxism.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. There's a lot of hatred, I would say. Outside of, like we had mentioned, a love for a kind of neorealism. There's like a condescension expressed towards, well, just like out and out towards Elia Kazan. There's a condescension towards Alfred Hitchcock in a blasé kind of way. There's a condescension towards basically anybody who doesn't appreciate LA in the exact way that he does.
right.
But he doesn't back it up.
And he even like attacks Joan Didion and is like she's just an author for rich white people who talks about how no one does anything to drive cars, but the buses are overcrowded. I'm like, the reason why the buses are overcrowded is that LA is a poorly planned city. I mean, and so the fact that everyone but the poor in downtown, and I'm not even sure how many of them are left now, frankly, because LA is super expensive to live in.
Well, it's like saying like Manhattan. It's like, when I was in Manhattan not too long ago, I said it feels like there's not much crime in Manhattan because it's too expensive for poor people to live here.
Right. I mean, like it's the ultimate. It's like super gentrified. So,
Oh, yeah.
so in that way, like, what are you trying to prove exactly? Because yes, these people existed, and yes, their stories are undercovered. And particularly, I agree with him. In the '80s, like a lot of those pop movies really were sort of like anti-black or anti-poor propaganda, like flat out. But those aren't the movies he's attacking with the most contempt. Interestingly, he doesn't attack Lethal Weapon with a lot of contempt.
Oh, no, no, no. In fact, if anything, he probably has a tinge of celebration with it because it portrays a fucked up cop. In fact, this may be a tangent, but one of the lines he said in the movie, which kind of disturbed me, was when they were going through Terminator, and they were saying, the Terminator was shooting up cops, and James Cameron got a kick of killing cops, and we all, those of us who were cop haters loved the way he staged it and everything. I'm like, that's kind of disturbing and disgusting in a way to me, even as someone who distrusts the police as much as I do. That was kind of uncomfortable to experience.
Well, it was interesting in the sense that, like, I don't like cops either as a class of people, but I also don't have fantasies about going in and just like blowing everybody away randomly, including all the desk clerks.
Yeah.
I mean, who obviously aren't doing anything to anybody except working for the government because they need a job. I mean, so like, that's a little screwed up.
Oh yeah, there's like, maybe it's not what he's intended, but he has a sort of subclass system amongst the working class. There are some working class people who are toadies and don't deserve my respect, and there are others who do deserve my respect. And it's like, okay,
Yeah, it's interesting. He doesn't like working class cinema though, for the most part. Like even good working class cinema. But like, yeah, Lethal Weapon portrays a screwed up cop, and so that gets a lot of things. And then the Terminator, then he talks about like all the pro cop movies of the late '80s, which I admit those are bad movies and they have a really pernicious like message. But it just seemed very like Manichaean in the way he approached that. And interestingly, the movies that had a much more nuanced view of cops, and he doesn't talk about their nuanced view, are those noir movies where there are good cops and bad cops and cops who are in between and caught up in things.
It feels like that never really came out in his discussion of LA Confidential, of which one of the interesting things about LA Confidential is like it's a movie which starts out with three cops who in their own way are unsympathetic, and eventually through their negotiation through the 50s and the way that the police was managing itself and their own past demons, they become a little bit more complicated and in some sense redeeming. Like that sort of whole arc just goes beyond him, in part because I think that is not his skill set. And I think why that's important is, again, as we think about this as a potential precursor to what would happen across the next 10 years, is like, it feels to me like, and LA Plays Itself, or Los Angeles Plays Itself, feels like it's an essay from a man who at least has some credibility and some skill set in laying out a certain kind of argument from a sociological and historical perspective. But over time, as we get, we basically not allow for it, just more and more people do this kind of video essay. It seems like the demand for skills and the ability to articulate a good argument and knowledge of history and knowledge of film history or knowledge of aesthetics becomes less and less important, to the point where now it feels like, if you have the misfortune of being very bored and watching a watchmojo.com video, you realize just how much in the doldrums we really are.
Yeah, beyond that, I think you even, like, a lot of these people don't even understand the theory they're quoting.
It's true.
I mean, I'm serious about that. Like, I just, like, the way, I think of the expansion of categories of the way people talk about appropriation, where in, like, left-wing sociology and anthropology, appropriation initially meant trying to erase a culture by not just using their cultural traits, but by claiming their cultural traits as if they never existed. And now, if you read, like, Salon articles on movies, or even things like belly dancing or whatever being the most famous one, it's just, you use something from another culture, how dare you?
Oh yeah, you're right.
That's not what that meant originally.
I'm sure if you press the author on it and you gave them what the actual meaning of appropriation was, they'll try to reconfigure what they said to fit it. I know exactly the essay you're referring to, and even call it an essay feels a bit much. You're right. The standards feel lower, but I wouldn't just say like, oh, back in the old days things were better. It just feels like it's gotten to the point where that amount of effort isn't required.
Right, and so, like, I at least feel like when you watch LA Watches Plays Itself, this guy has an encyclopedia knowledge of LA's history, and he has at least watched a metric crap ton of film.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even though he doesn't have any aesthetic appreciation of it, or if he does, it's, like, very mixed in with a lot of other things, and very one-sided. It's still not, it's not what we see now. I mean, I'll even compare him to Zizek. Like, Zizek knows psychoanalysis, but when he makes historical arguments, he's all over the place. Like, for example, what he defends the Jacobins for in a number of films and books, he condemns Stalin for.
For sure, you're right. He is a bit disparate on this, and I don't know if it's because he changes his opinion for the audience that he's talking to. But if you do listen to him talk about, the French Revolution and the Jacobins, he very much comes across as an extreme Jacobin, and yet very similar, if not identical, actions in the Russian Revolution. He says, this was just perverted, disgusting things. So it's like, you can't have both in my mind.
I mean, there's just a lot of that. Well, I don't feel like this guy is necessarily inconsistent, except for the fact that his snobbishness actually undercuts his attempt at, like, class-based understanding of film. Mm-hmm. Because if you're snobby, for example, one of the interesting things that this sort of discussion leaves out, doesn't deal with at all. Why are these narratives about LA so appealing to the broad scale of America, and largely working class people who see these potboiler movies?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you got the sense, wouldn't you say, that if he tries to think about why people like these particular kinds of views on LA, he probably conceives of the people outside of LA as being Manhattanites, like Woody Allen, who look down on the sort of crass, low culture of LA. But I think you're correct in pointing out that, look, the majority of people who watch these films are not people from Manhattan. They're not, they're just, typical, the average mass audience. I mean, like, they're the ones who like they loved the cop movies of the late 80s, early 90s. They liked the cynical movies from the mid 90s and late 90s. He doesn't really articulate a reason why, beyond a general LA represents what everybody doesn't like about America or the world.
But this is not true. Like maybe it does, but LA is not, to portray, to have the argument that somehow LA is somehow indicative of urban America. Actually, his entire argument's actually predicated on it not being, because he talks about how LA is unique in it's the way it deals with cops and the way it portrays cop condescension towards the subject.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, one of the best sections, and I think you agree with me, is his discussion of Dragnet, which is pretty dead on.
Oh yeah, he nails it, and yeah, he has a really good line of argument about, like, what's interesting about Jack Webb and his condescension. It's not that he represented the average cop. What was disturbing was that, and this is absolutely true if you ever know the history of Dragnet, he represented the ideal cop.
And his ideal cop is condescending, and
the condescension is there in every episode. The antagonism towards youth is there in every episode. There's a famous episode where they actually show a clip from about, like, a young pothead family who, as the plot goes on, well, actually, let me give you the plot of that one because it's interesting.
That's where they accidentally killed the baby, right?
Yeah. So the story,
I had actually seen that as a kid.
The story there is, like, the girl's wealthy father hires the police to basically scare her into not taking drugs, which I'm pretty sure feels kind of illegal. But besides the case, they go to there. They said, "Don't do pot. It's bad for you," basically. And the thing is, they finally go up to do something about it. They're having a party. Everybody's high, and the baby was in the bathtub and it drowned. Now, here's the thing: they said this is all based on a true story. I call bullshit on it because that exact same plot, minus one important detail, happens in John Updike's Rabbit Run. The main character's baby is drowned because his wife is distracted, but she's distracted because she's drunk, not because she's smoking pot, which is also important because, again, Dragnet doesn't give a shit about smoking. Jack Webb smokes like a chimney. They don't give a shit about anything that's quote-unquote legal. They only give a shit about what is quote-unquote illegal. And it's funny how in that episode also there's a throwaway line about how saying, like, look, in a few generations' time this is going to be legal. And Jack Webb's like, not going to happen. No chance in hell. People aren't that stupid. And it really makes me laugh now. He's so adamant about his knowledge that this won't change and everything. I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's what Los Angeles plays itself captures so well about the cops is precisely when they go into Dragnet, and that's, to me, like, this program at its most excellent and its most coherent.
But at the same point, like, that's predicated on the fact that LA doesn't represent the rest of the United States, even the rest of the urban United States, and not just in this, like, Manhattanites hate us. Well, yeah, they do, but Manhattanites hate everybody. So, like, let's talk about what's going on here, because in a way, this film is also snobby and pretends that LA cinema doesn't exist in the context of the rest of both the United States and eventually the entire damn world.
Isn't it also interesting, going off on the thread that you're doing, doesn't this feel also sort of like a manifestation of the weird articulation and lack thereof for an identity politics style thinking? In a way, the identity issue here is, I am a true LA person. I'm not from Hollywood. I represent the real LA, and I'm going to get sort of condescending, snobbish about everything that's not that. It feels like it has that manifestation to it.
Right. Well, it's the interesting thing about identity politics is it's based off nationalism and regionalism, but it's not about nations and regions. And I don't want to go too much into this because this is a long conversation that's really better for a different show. But it's not. This feels like, yes, we're going to talk about real LA, and yes, real LA is also working class downtown LA. It's not the suburbs. It's not Hollywood. It's not Pasadena. It's not Mulholland Drive. But I'm like, okay, so I get that people don't show real downtown except to make it look bad in the 80s a lot of the time. But that's not really, like, he's being just as selective about what LA is as the people he's critiquing.
Right, yes. And in a way, it's at times, when you talk about semi-incoherence, it feels, and I'm not going to say like in a conspiratorial mindset kind of way, but it feels like, I'm going to tell you the secret, true history of LA. This history you don't get in the media. It's like, well, is it secret in the sense that we're trying to hide it? Mostly,
but then he critiques all the noir. His critique of noir is that the secret history stuff is bullshit. I mean,
Right,
that's
yeah.
basically like his big complaint about noir, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Or at the very least, the neo noir, absolutely. I think he does speak well enough of Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity. Primarily, he likes it because it's a condemnation of bourgeois middle class, which it
Which he
is.
also calls Woody Allen films a manifestation of the middle class, and I'm like, what are you on?
Yeah, what middle class does Woody Allen represent?
Like,
Yeah.
like, are you serious? Because he was just like everything bourgeois, everything middle class, and I'm like, one, bourgeois and middle class aren't the same, and two, not to be, like if you're gonna be a Marxist, you do it right, and two, Woody Allen doesn't epitomize that. He epitomizes like the aging Manhattan dandy. That's super connected. I mean, I just felt like there were claims made in this movie that either weren't substantiated. I'll talk about one that's completely we haven't even touched, or like actually showed a myopia about class and stuff itself. Like I'm just like I was like when you call him like Woody Allen the representative of the middle class, you don't know what the middle class is in the United States.
Well, yeah, it's like, did you get the sense that he also manifested a sort of, yeah, basically the same thing he's trying to critique, in which, in his conception of the United States, there is Los Angeles, Hollywood, Manhattan, nothing else.
Yeah, no, there really isn't. There's not even Chicago.
Well, he references Chicago once, but only in the fact that LA played Chicago. He doesn't really say anything substantial about it, nor about the Chicago mindset versus the Midwestern mindset. Forget about the Midwest; it doesn't play a role.
Or the South, or the Pacific Northwest, or
Yeah, exactly.
anything else. It's just Manhattan and LA.
He does mention San Francisco obliquely, but he does it to dismiss Hitchcock. He's like, Hitchcock is a lowbrow tourist. Oh, he likes to go to San Francisco because it looks prettier. It's like, yeah, because that's all Hitchcock movies are about. Pretty pictures of San Francisco.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about of all the people to call a tourist director.
And a lowbrow tourist director.
Well, okay, I can follow that Hitchcock is actually he's a highbrow thinker for a lowbrow audience. Like, let's be frank about that. His movies were aimed at everybody. Other than just having pretty vistas as backgrounds, the location of Hitchcock movies is irrelevant.
Oh yeah, I mean it's no accident that he chose to film nearly everything artificially on a stage. Hitchcock was an expressionist filmmaker. Expressionist filmmakers just go over the heads of people who think that they love neorealism.
And also, like, it was interesting because I also felt like he was like, well, at least, well, Hitchcock lived here. So I was like, so if you're accusing him of being a tourist director, his adoptive home of LA, why would he do that anyway? He's a tourist director. He lives there.
It's very incoherent, and yet at least he had the decency to say Hitchcock never said a bad thing about LA. It's like, yes, because it wasn't his subject. Hitchcock was not a sociological director in that front, and he shouldn't be punished for not being one.
Yeah, I get, like, the snobbishness of Woody Allen's visit to LA at the end of Annie Hall, which is the only time LA is ever mentioned in a Woody Allen movie, as far as I know.
Yeah, outside of like just the same general, like, go to LA to make TV that Woody Allen is
Right.
going to do. But yeah, that's about it. Yeah, it's very narrow.
It's seriously, like, not. Like, I don't think even Woody Allen wants you to agree with him in that scene. He's being a jackass.
Oh yeah, Woody Allen is not ignorant of, nor would he argue against thinking of his characters as unreliable narrators. You're not supposed to think Alvy Singer is right, especially because he's going to LA in the context of a dying relationship, and LA has represented the fact that his girlfriend is leaving him, so he hates LA because LA has taken something from him, not because he has an objective disgust with LA. It's a subjective response to his condition. Again, that requires an ability to read text that way, which this film isn't interested in doing.
And on the end note, we would like to say that you should see this movie.
That's my favorite part. We love how this film is constructed. We like the talent on some regard of this filmmaker, but we spent about an hour saying what we didn't like about it.
Well, it's just hard because like other than the Dragnet, which I think is straight on, he does have some interesting but also wrong-headed things to say about Blade Runner because he doesn't deal with the source material at all. And the fact that city is not just LA, it's also like even though it's LA, it's also Tokyo and
It's think of it as one. It's not even a megaopolis. It's one uniopolis. It's like the whole planet is L.A.
right. And it's all I mean like and it's LA, it's Seoul, it's Tokyo.
Right.
And if you actually look at the design, it's very much designed that way, and in many ways it looks like an Asian city. And yes, Asian cities are sort of urban planners' wet dreams. You know, they're vertically aligned and they're walkable, and there's hardly any. Well, the traffic sucks, but man, I just felt like okay, so that's what he's going to say about that.
But you know what was really funny throwaway line he had? He says like, compared to the new future we're going to get, LA it feels utopian because it has exciting cityscapes, whereas the new future will be more plastic, more artificially robotic induced, and will be stupider. In other words, in his mind, the real horror is that the world is going to turn into suburbia, which feels stupid. And plus, it feels like if you think that outside of the original ending, which nobody regards anyway, if you think that Blade Runner is to presenting a potential utopian vision of urban life, I have a feeling you might have misread the movie. I'm just going to go off on a limb. You
Yeah,
might.
it's also the urbanness of that is superfluous to it, except that it's everywhere. I guess maybe it's like, oh, but people are mourning suburbia. Maybe his implied point, but he doesn't make it. He tries to let you draw that conclusion from the film, but just like you're not even dealing with the source material there, or the fact that that's not just L.A. I'm sorry, it's like it's every major city sort of combined.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just happens to be LA. These are particular. That also could have been New Manhattan. It could have been Neo Tokyo. I mean, it's not. That's missing the point.
Oh yeah, the fact that it was. I think in Blade Runner the only reason that it was L.A. is because Blade Runner was constructed along the lines of a noir, which it is. So in that regards, its locus is L.A. Less the L.A. that that's quote unquote the real LA, but more the LA of the noir. I think that in my mind, that's the main reason, that it's LA. I mean, Philip K. Dick, I think even lived in Los Angeles at this point.
I was going to say, like, Philip K. Dick, the reason why he made it LA is because that's where he lived. I don't even think it had anything much more beyond that. Because the noir elements of that are more in the movie than the book.
I think you're absolutely right there.
But it's just fascinating because this movie is interesting to compare to the YouTube things because it's smartly wrong-headed. I will say it's smart, even though we agree that basically this guy's not reading genre at all and thus being profoundly unfair to the movies he's talking about because he's not reading genre. He's just considering that completely irrelevant, except for noir, which he gets hung up on.
Right, yeah. So in my mind, I disagree a lot with the aesthetics of LA Plays itself, but in my mind, disagreeing with those arguments or his use of aesthetics is inconsequential in regard to the question, was this well made and is it worth watching?
It's definitely worth watching. I mean, you need time.
Oh, yeah, you need 3 hours. We're going to tell you that right now.
And you're going to have to you have to pay attention because he does this kind of almost obnoxious thing where sometimes he flats out makes like bold assertions that he doesn't back up. But then other times, like, he doesn't actually make the assertion he's trying to make. He just shows you the film clip and kind of gives you a hint, which is maddening. Like, for example, when he talks about disaster movies, which is one of those things where he says disaster movies always come out when they need people to like give in to authority and whatever. And I'm like, they needed people to give in to authority in 1996. Right. I'm sorry. That's not actually a strong argument.
Or he also says like, people love disaster movies because they like to destroy LA. I thought it was crasser to destroy Paris and then he has the throwaway line because they like too many, Jerry Lewis movies or something. It's like he has these throwaway lines which are a little bit annoying. They don't do.
I also think like DC and New York get destroyed on a regular basis. I mean, like people actually just like destroying cities.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I think if you look back on the most recent disaster films, I think they've upped the ante from just destroying LA or a series of cities to now just basically obliterating the planet as such. And I would argue that's more of a manifestation of a concern over the end results of, global warming and all such related elements, more so than like the decadence of LA will lead to its
Right. I mean,
destruction.
actually, what is it? That guy who interviewed with us said cli-fi. That's really what that is.
Right.
And also maybe appealing to a broader. Another reason why it might be that's a little bit more cynical is they need to sell movies in China, and who gives a crap about LA when there's Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou.
So, like a slight tangent, but it's related. I think our fears about, not fears, but our understanding of why the regionalism of U.S. movies are gone was revealed in the Sony leak the other week. Remember when I think I sent you the presentation deck that they had where they were laughably bad, but in many of the slides about like movies, what they should and should not emphasize, they said don't emphasize socio-political elements, and more importantly, don't emphasize Americanism.
Right. Which is why I feel like you only have movies that have things to say right now. This is going to be controversial, but this is one thing I think while people have been more attracted to kitsch, is because kitsch isn't expected to have a global audience. It actually can still make regional and local points and also be way more nuanced, oddly enough. And the only other time where that's allowed is basically Oscar season. I mean, seriously. I mean, so like you can either make, a horror movie or, a neo grindhouse movie or something, or you can make like Remains of the Day or Dallas Buyers Club. Everything else you need to do, or you can make a comedy. Comedies are still regional because they don't translate well to Asia. They kind of translate okay to Latin America.
Well, it's because if the comedy is verbal play, it's hard to translate. If the comedy is like broad, it's
yeah. But even sometimes the broad comedy, like it doesn't even always work. I've just seen through many a comedies that they tried to sell in Asia when I was living in Korea, and no one would laugh except for me. And these weren't good movies, by the way. It was like the Dark Shadows remake and stuff. But for some reason, they thought that would play in Korea, where there's no history of that at all. And so like they just didn't, like most people, even people who spoke English, didn't really get the movie. And then if it involves dry humor, satire, or irony, I'm just going to tell you this is a cultural thing. That almost doesn't exist, at least in Korean and Japanese culture. And so that doesn't translate over. And so these big tent movies, they might be funny, they might be broadly funny, but a lot of times that's not what they're putting in there is actually for different audiences. So the broadly funny stuff is like for more or less for Americans and Canadians and to some degree people in Latin America and Europe.
Yeah, that's
and then, like these big explosion spectacles, that's largely because that translates to everywhere.
Right, and I think again that emphasizes the periodicity of when this documentary was made. If it's made in 2003, it's like that's like the tail end of when you can get away with, regionally specific LA material, which isn't just like he says in the doc, just there for expediency. I mean, like post 2003, it feels like most of those Big Ten movies, like I said, they don't even have the wherewithal to talk about LA in any substantial view outside of in general. Like,
can you think of many movies even about New York?
Oh yeah,
I mean even about New York. I mean there are proxy stand-ins kind of like in the comic book movies there were already proxy stand-ins because Metropolis is obviously Chicago. I think.
I think Gotham and Metropolis are basically New York, just different versions of it. But it's changed. It depends on who's writing it. What do they bring to the table?
Because sometimes I think it is clear that the Midwesternness of Superman makes that Chicago.
Oh, but, maybe, yeah.
But other times I think it is New York. But they do, that's why they do that though, because you can move the cities around. I mean, like. What you're using as the base doesn't really matter as much. It's a generic American city of a certain type. And you see that in movies now, right? Like, there is Genera York and maybe Genera LA, Genera, like, suburban America. But they're completely irrelevant. it's just epiphenomenal to the plot. Like even think about like in the Iron Man movie, the third one where he has to go and hide out in like rural America. Where is that? I mean,
Right.
is that Midwest? Is that the South? Is that New England? You have no idea.
So in a weird way, another way of looking at the Los Angeles plays itself is it's in a weird way a documentary that is nostalgic in a certain way, not because it has like looking back to an old better time, but more like it is thinking of a way of reading movies which is no longer really going to happen from Hollywood in that regard. Like, I mean, the dissecting what it means to depict LA.
We won't be dissecting like big tent movies. We'll be dissecting the if you're gonna dissect anything with regionalism, it's going to be Oscar bait or it's going to be cult movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those are going to be things that are going to be allowed to be regional, and that's not to be also to talk about. That's not just the United States. I always talk about how much I love Korean cinema. Korean cinema is almost dead. That's why a lot of those Korean directors have started making like mid budget kind of art movies in the U.S. or in England, not in the U.S. but in English primarily. It's because there's fewer and fewer Korean films made.
It's like Polish cinema has an interesting, weird counterexample, but proves the point in that recently the Polish cinema hasn't been in its best of state, but it's still going on. In fact, Ida is one film which has come across and well. But the thing with Polish films is it is so, not all of them, but a fair amount of them are so fixated, not just on Polish history, but the minutia of Polish history and not necessarily making things explicit for the generic audience that it's so hard for those movies to sell over here.
I mean, actually, though, I think it's interesting because if you'd have asked me in 1999, I would have said the United States was opening up to world movies. Maybe even in 2003, 2004. Because you started seeing a lot of those Chinese movies made. They were making back here, even though they were kind of big tent kung fu movies. But still, like they were mainstream, massive, winning,
right.
Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the hero. Whereas now, you're not going to know if a movie's partly made in China and partly made in LA. And there's a lot of joint ventures now, actually.
Like, yeah, it became less like, a global marketplace for movies from around the globe. It just became a marketplace for global movies, period. In other words, not, completely generic, right? It could be internationally produced, like you said, but it doesn't really make a difference. Those specificities.
So, I mean, when he was talking about like Hollywood's, cultural imperialism, I'm like, well, the funny thing about Hollywood cultural imperialism is that at this point, it's even culturally imperial to its own country because it's basically Generistan. Even by Hollywood standards, it's Generistan. Like we've almost gone back. Like think about like in the 1950s where they had the transatlantic accent because we wanted to appeal to a British audience as well as an American audience. So we'll have this accent that is unidentifiable as either. I mean, it's like that, but way more so, but not with accents because these people aren't even speaking English, so you don't need to do that. It'll either be dubbed or it'll be subtitled depending on the country's particular preference. But
yeah, it's so like that's why in a weird way, even though again thinking back on where this documentary sits, it's forward looking in part because like I said, we talked about like the format of how it takes and how that sort of was taken up by quote unquote new media, but it's also a representative of the end state of like what we had just talked about in a transition to more, for lack of a better term, generico content, for lack of a better term. We have like, big movies that everybody wants to go to. We have a type of way of communicating about it, like you said, secondary commentary, the sort of BuzzFeedification in some respects of a lot of things. So it feels transitory, like a transitional piece as well, which does make it also kind of interesting on that front.
Yeah, so I definitely watch it, but I do think it's interesting. It's like nostalgia for being negative about a thing that doesn't even exist to be negative about anymore. I mean, seriously, it's like I can't even complain about this anymore because in the grand scheme of things, LA is only important for movies now because people can shoot there really cheaply comparatively. Although even that's ending. I mean, most people are shooting a lot more in Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
they're financing it in the States and shooting it in Vancouver. So
Yeah, pretty much. And then like and then we're making the Blu-ray discs in Mexico.
right, so it's just half the producers are probably Chinese. So and also AMC is owned by a Chinese company now. People don't know that, just so you know. And I'm not saying this to like make everyone like super nativist. My like utopia vision from film from 2009 when I was 19, 20 was that we were going to see films from all over the world finally,
Right.
and it was going to be awesome. And they're all going to be different, and I'm going to have to learn all these historical contexts and but they're still enjoyable enough on their own that if you don't do that, and that's just not what happened.
No, it changed to product, right? I mean, it was product for
It was
a
product
while,
then, but it was at least product that sort of like banked on its specificity. And it was sort of banking on that whole thing in literature that we still kind of believe in literature, but we don't believe in film, which I think is interesting. We believe that specificity is universal in literature. No one believes that in film anymore.
Mm.
I mean, maybe they do for like Oscar-winning films, but no big tent director believes that anymore.